You're looking at the big picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Hey, listen, before we go into this interview, which is with a reporter who covers health policy in America, and it's absolutely fabulous. But after it was recorded last night, yesterday, the Trump administration completely gutted the CDC. And you'll find in the interview, I asked her whether we are better, whether we learned anything from COVID, whether we are prepared, for a pandemic to come. And she said, no, we didn't. But she still had some confidence that there were experts in the CDC. And she wrote this morning to me saying, I know we have this interviews airing, but oh my gosh, the CDC has been gutted, and that's catastrophic. And now I want you to hear Amy Maxmen, who's just terrific.
When most people talk about our news ecosystem, they think about political news, they think about entertainment or sports or sort of general purpose news organization. But, in fact, some of the best journalism sits in far more focused news organizations. KFF, for example, is the gold standard for news about health policy in the United States. They excel at things like polling and policy analysis and providing health information and journalism. And within that fabulous organization, Amy Maxmen is a star. She's KFF's national public health correspondent, and I'm thrilled that she's joining us today. Hi, Amy.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hey, before we get into the news and the questions about healthcare in America, I think people would be fascinated to learn a little bit more about you, some of the reporting you've done around the world, and particularly your work in outbreaks that actually sound terrifying.
Yeah. So I've been reporting on public health around the world for over a decade now. The reason why I've been why I was drawn into reporting on outbreaks is actually because it's the confluence of so many things. It's the virus or the pathogen itself, the kind of biological side, which I always find interesting. But then there's everything about culture and how that will shape how infections travel. It's a lot about policy and about governments and politics. So it kind of has a lot of things coming together. And I'm sort of a person that thinks about systems. So that's an appealing place for me to be.
Yeah. What were some of just to give people a sense, some of the outbreaks that you found yourself spending time in and around?
I've reported on malaria a lot. The thing that also just, I dove into is in 2014 and 2015, when there was the biggest Ebola outbreak that the world's ever seen, even to this day in West Africa, I went to Sierra Leone and I ended up spending 3 months there during the Ebola outbreak. So that was kind of when I just started seeing how even the local politics within different cities really mattered for how bad an outbreak was. So that was very fascinating. I went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, actually when Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, was there. So I spent time with him and the WHO in Congo during that Ebola outbreak, and then I was here in the U.S. during COVID, and I was sort of this is it. This is the thing that I thought was going to happen, and here we are.
Well, being around in an Ebola outbreak sounds absolutely terrifying, but also, I guess, in its own way, fascinating. You learn a lot. Let's say I'm curious about what we learned. I mean, in Trump's first term, we had COVID, this incredibly terrible global pandemic, and our response was, my words, not yours, but divisive and incoherent. Trump, too, began with a measles outbreak. Did the administration learn any lessons from COVID that helped them do a better job with measles?
No. In fact, it seems the U.S. in general has kind of gone in the opposite direction, which is been pretty disheartening. I think a lot of my writing in COVID was sort of to say, not just my writing, so many journalists, so many epidemiologists, researchers, there was all of this work done, like, how can we roll out testing faster? How can we respond quicker? How can we get information out there better? And in fact, it seems the U.S. has sort of gone in the opposite direction, most pointedly with vaccines. But yeah, and so with the measles outbreak, you could really see what happens when there's interference at the top.
So, I mean, the lessons we could have learned, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like in an outbreak of any kind of infectious disease, testing, contact tracing, public information are essential to do as rapidly and as effectively as you can.
Exactly. Like speed is the main thing. It's like a fire. When it's small, you can put it out fairly easily. The bigger it gets, these massive wildfires, the harder they are to control, the more damage is done. Nobody wants, kids to not be able to go to school. Nobody wants businesses to shut down. So ideally, the whole idea is to move really quickly so that, you know who's infected. You can isolate the people who are infected. If there's vaccines, use vaccines to limit the spread of a thing, to act fast before it gets really out of control.
And limiting the spread not only protects the individuals who would be infected, but if I'm right, also makes it harder for the virus to have a reservoir of bodies in which it can continue to mutate and evade our defenses. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So it kind of, yes, it gives the virus less of a reservoir. I mean, we might get to we're on track to get to a place where measles, we eliminated measles from the U.S. in 2000, which just means it's not spreading kind of regularly within the U.S. There's always cases that, people come from abroad where there's more measles and they're unvaccinated, they come back, and there's a couple of cases that happens. But we've eliminated it in the U.S., but there's already kind of modeling papers just sort of tracking when it's going to come back with our levels of vaccination going down.
Okay. So there were lessons I don't want to go, I did at the time blame the Trump administration for its handling of COVID, but that's history. But you could say they could have learned from that, and when they had another opportunity, done a better job. And your sense, I can't tell, what did happen with measles? Was it even worse in the way it was handled?
Yeah. So to go back to February. So in February, you've got this measles outbreak in West Texas. And, I was talking to people on the ground in West Texas, local health officials, and there was every sign that this was not going to be one of those outbreaks where somebody returns from, say, the UK and they infect somebody else and then it sort of fizzles out after, say, 10 cases. This was not that, because by the time that they detected the first cases, people were already in the hospital, which means there's many more cases that were just undetected. And there was really low rates of vaccination. There were schools where, say, 40% of kindergartners had their MMR vaccine. So there was every sign that this was going to be a really bad outbreak. And therefore, like I said, you've got to act really fast because it was slated to be bad. At this same time in February, that's when first the Trump administration had put a freeze on communications when Trump took office for a couple of weeks, but that kind of quietly lasted at the CDC. So CDC staff were not allowed to communicate with their partners on the ground, like local health officials. And what I did is I sent Freedom of Information Act requests to the local health departments, also to, I should say, the state and the CDC, which didn't return them. But I did get email records from local health departments, and you just see the health officials saying, we really need to consult with the CDC. Is there a way I can talk with the CDC? And that was just met by crickets. So at that time at the CDC, there was, kind of a silencing that was happening. And also it was being gutted. There were those first huge layoffs in February.
Yeah. Amy, I don't understand. I just don't understand. What was the purpose of saying to the CDC in a health emergency, you're not allowed to talk to anybody?
I don't know the purpose, but what's been happening is, there's a real attempt to gain control over federal agencies, and the CDC is a prime target of that control. And I think that was all part of it. I don't know if it was specifically about measles. I really don't know about that. But
they never, I'm sorry, they never stated a reason. They've
never stated a reason. And I should say, I reached out to the CDC, I reached out to the White House, I reached out to HHS, and I did not get a response to very pointed questions about all of this. But I know from talking with people within the CDC at that time that they were not able to talk freely. They had to walk they had to walk on a tightrope about what they could say at all, if anything.
During an outbreak.
And, the CDC is, we think a lot about their recommendations, but a huge point of having a national public health agency is outbreak response. They're really an emergency response organization in part, and it could be a cancer cluster or a salmonella outbreak or measles or something else like COVID that happens, and we need them to act quickly and not be kind of bogged down by rules like this that kind of bar them from talking. Yeah,
I'm going to come back to this, I think, to the CDC. No, let's stay with the CDC for a minute. You've been paying attention to, I guess, the Trump's administration's, how do I say this, evolving ideas about science and health, although maybe they don't have any and it's all about control. I just don't know. Their approach to medications, their investment in research, professionalism of the CDC. Let's focus on the CDC for a minute. What is going on there, and how? Every president, they get elected, they have policy responsibilities. But your sense that the Trump administration's leadership at the CDC is not really just about policy, but about something else that isn't tied to public health?
It's really hard for me to know what motives are, but I can
strike
say
the question.
Yeah, it's okay. I can say what's happening. Yeah.
Yes, please. Yeah.
What's happening is, first, there's these mass layoffs. So most divisions of the CDC, the directors are now ousted. They've either resigned under pressure, they've been laid off, or they've been kind of removed and put in kind of positions where they're really quieted. So there's been, just massive gutting at the CDC. There's been kind of interference in the way that the CDC is able to fund programs. I have a new story that will be coming out soon that's sort of about this. So they couldn't, for example, with measles, Texas asked for money to help with their very expensive measles response in March. It didn't arrive until May from the federal budget. So there's sort of this gutting of what the CDC can do. And at the same time, you have Robert Kennedy, Health and Human Services Secretary, and he is, putting in some people who have really fringe ideas, who have promoted sort of just complete misinformation about vaccines and more. So those people are being put into office. During the measles outbreak, RFK, kept talking about vitamin A as if, listen, he didn't say it in these words, but he would, completely, constantly repeat various rumors that are wrong about measles vaccines, saying, they have fetus debris in them, which they don't, saying that they cause encephalitis, which is brain swelling, and they don't do that. So he would be saying this about vaccines, which understandably would make parents nervous, and then kind of suggesting that vitamin A would be able to quickly treat any problems. And he even, talking with people within the CDC, he told the CDC to really invest, look into vitamin A, which they did, and the studies on vitamin A really show that it's helpful in countries, within sub-Saharan Africa where there's really high vitamin A deficiency, where there's malnourishment. But there's nothing really suggesting that it's very helpful in places like the U.S. where vitamin A deficiency is around 1%. So it can be helpful when people are very deficient. There's nothing to say it's helpful here. And it's certainly not a reason to not get vaccinated.
Amy, did anyone overdose on vitamin A? Were there any bad side effects from people who just said, oh, I'm going to really take as much of this as I can?
Yeah, so in the emails, once again, the emails I got from local health departments, there were doctors saying, we're seeing kids come in with really high levels of vitamin A in their blood. Vitamin A can be really toxic. It can cause liver damage. It can damage fetuses. So we'll see, are there, problems with babies being born, or maybe we won't be able to know if that's the case. But it can be toxic because it's not water soluble. So talking with people again in the CDC, they were just so nervous. They tried to, put all this stuff in there. They had to insert vitamin A into kind of the public releases they put out. They would try and caveat it by saying, talk to your doctor first. They'll only do it under a doctor's supervision. But you can buy vitamin A from pharmacies. And sure enough, there were pharmacies saying vitamin A is flying off the shelf in West Texas.
Okay, so you've described a CDC that had its scientific expertise gutted, that there was political interference with the funding, that some of their recommendations now are hoaxy. Should Americans be really concerned that if there is another contagious outbreak, something like COVID, that we are even in worse shape than we were when that epidemic came to our shores, that we're really unprepared?
I feel like there's no doubt. There is, without a doubt, we are in such worse shape right now. A huge reason is because of, since 2020, it's become very political to take points of view on public health. There's a lot of polling from KFF that shows, and I should say the polling side is very separate from the journalism side, but they do great polling. There's a lot of polls suggesting that, there's a huge split between Republicans and Democrats in what they believe about matters of public health, and that's because of, what various leaders say or don't say. And so that's going to be incredibly dangerous, just sort of trying to play to a base versus saying, as a government, let's be responsible and have one voice on, what we think is the best move that's informed by evidence. So I think without a doubt we'll be in worse shape now. And on top of that, you've got this, massive kind of these vaccine questioning let's not helpful.
Talk about that. I want to talk about that. I mean, Secretary Kennedy, I think this week, what did he say this week that was so crazy? Circumcision causes autism or something?
Oh, yeah. Every week there's something, huh? So, and the funny thing is I knew about this one because I've read a lot of Children's Health Defense. This is this anti-vaccine organization that he founded before becoming our health secretary. And they've written about this circumcision stuff before. So basically, Kennedy was talking about this sort of link between circumcision and Tylenol and autism. For all of this, Children's Health Defense sort of referred to this kind of paper that was in, a scientific journal from scientists. It wasn't like even I don't want to call it a study. It was basically kind of like I call it a hypothesis generating paper, where basically the researchers were like, gee, I wonder if Tylenol given early in life could be linked to autism. And they sort of did a quick and dirty sort of job of being like, well, listen, there's not good data on how much Tylenol little kids take. So maybe we could look at circumcision and make an assumption that, baby boys are given Tylenol after circumcision and therefore look for rates of circumcision in different countries and rates of autism. Now, there's all sorts of caveats, and they have a whole, they have paragraphs at the bottom of their paper about this is not, maybe basically the take home was, why an epidemiologist or epidemiologists should look into a possible connection between Tylenol early in life and autism. They simply are saying maybe this should be studied. You know, I'm sure there's a lot of debates about should they have published this or not, but nonetheless, they did it kind of in a way that, if I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, was just sort of like, yeah, maybe this is worth thinking about, and here's a way to do it. Children's Health Defense and Kennedy ran with this as if it's like a finding, and it is nothing like that. Everything, a lot of what he said, I've realized, you know, he'll mention scientific papers, but it's like he puts them through some sort of like funhouse mirror where that's not what the paper's saying at all.
We had this with Tylenol. Like, talk about what the author of the study cited said, and this crazy president saying to, you know, pregnant women, when I think maybe the only painkiller they can take is Tylenol, you know, suffer, don't do it.
Yes. So I spoke with the author of one of the papers they referred to support their position. And, you know, here's the thing, you know, whereas with vaccines and autism, there's been so many large studies really showing there's no association between vaccination in childhood and autism. That is, I feel confident in saying that's known. Don't worry about it. With Tylenol, there's just not as much good work on it, and it's really hard to study. Again, hard to know how much Tylenol pregnant people take during, you know, when they're pregnant. So there's this study, and the author looked at like what's been done in the area, and they sort of said, you know, there's really signs of maybe there is kind of a correlation here. Maybe there's kind of connections between how much Tylenol somebody takes when they're pregnant and autism. There's other studies showing that kind of link falls apart when you take into account genetics and things like that. I would say, talking to a lot of autism researchers, my take home is most of them have, you know, who've looked at the data think, no, there's probably not a link. However, nobody I talked to, the scientists weren't like 100% there's no link, which is only to say probably not. And I should say the studies that find a link, it's a very small association, and it would be coupled with other things like genetics we know underlies autism. So it would be coupled with other things, and it's small, so it in no way would account for the epidemic that we're seeing. I don't want to use Kennedy's words. I take that back. It would in no way account for high rates of autism. It's small. It's a small effect, if anything. So it's one thing. I can actually say I would be sympathetic to an idea of saying, you know what, let's fund more research in this area, or let's like convene a panel of scientists to really look at the data hard and think about this. I'm personally in favor of that. That's fine. That's not what happened. What happened at this, you know, historic announcement that, you know, has been alluded to all year long by the Trump administration is they pretended like, you know, here it is. We found a major cause. We've got the solution. And that's really problematic. Trump threw vaccines into the mix, which there's no evidence for. It was a wild conference. It really was. And yeah.
Well, and didn't the author of the study say, whoa, this is not what I meant?
Yes.
You heard it? Yeah.
Yes. When I talked to her, even in the weeks leading up to it, she was just saying she was feeling really sick to her stomach. Because she wanted, I think, you know, I wrote a piece that was just sort of nuanced on this where, like I said, there's researchers who do want to see, are there risks of certain factors? Are there risks out there? We want to know that. It takes time to do the genuine research. The answers are often kind of not clear. Like even the conclusion of their own paper is, you know, maybe more judicious use of Tylenol. Maybe, you know, if you have a little headache, don't go for it, which is fine. You know, that's a fine recommendation.
What you're saying to me is if a researcher says, I think there's a topic we haven't looked into enough and we should look into some more.
Yeah.
The administration says, see, we told you it's true.
Yes, they kind of turn it into doubt. You know, they kind of turn questions into misinformation to scare people and to pretend that they've got these simple solutions when, quite honestly, a lot of the problems we have today, and are systemic. They're complicated. And they require kind of large-scale changes. Like there's more evidence that say air pollution might contribute to some autism cases, but that would require regulations and a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, that's not on their agenda.
No,
sure.
It's not.
So, and this whole undermining of vaccine thing and the changing of the committee that approves, what vaccines have to be out there. What do you make of that?
It's extremely troubling. It's extremely troubling the way that RFK just fired all of these people who have real expertise in vaccines and immunology, and he replaced them with, anybody who's been in public health for a while. We were kind of guessing who he was going to put on, kind of like the who's who of misinformation spreaders out there. And he sort of, packed the committee with people like this. And yeah, we know that Susan Menares, the former director of the CDC, he basically ousted her because she said she wasn't willing to just sign off on what this committee recommended for vaccines. And he replaced her with this biotech entrepreneur who did. I think, big picture, the issue here is people, whereas I used to never think twice if somebody had a really basic question about a vaccine or, should you take malaria medicine when you go somewhere, I used to just say, go to the CDC website. They have very clear information. This is what doctors do all the time. Just refer to it. The fear is this is slowly not going to be the case. So the CDC will no longer be that place. And there'll be different places like Infectious Disease Society of America or American Academy of Pediatrics that might post recommendations. But, it's not a place that just everybody in the U.S. can just go to for balanced information.
So I guess I have to ask you with regard to public health, the same thing I've been asking other people with regard to the federal government. I'm in Chicago where they sent troops, right? And, the nice judge told them to go away yesterday. But the kind of question that I want to ask you, so the health-related similar question is, what do Americans do to protect themselves now? How do we organize to get, as you said in the beginning, if something goes wrong, you need speed, you need information, how do we get that if the federal government has decided they're not in that business anymore? Or worse, they're in a competing business?
I mean, the issue is, it might depend a lot on where you live. Will the state, I know I talked with health officials at New York City's Department of Health during the last large measles outbreak. The one in West Texas is the biggest we've seen in 30 years. It's even much larger if you include all of the states it's now spread to. But the next biggest one was in 2019 in New York City. And the city put a ton of money into the response. And the leadership at the time, we can debate on, how effective their measures were, but the leadership also was declaring it an emergency. The same thing happened in Washington State, where you had politicians saying this is an emergency. We need to do emergency things, including infuse this response with money so that we can hire more people to help out with the response. So it'll depend on where you live. So maybe you live in a place that does that, but maybe you live in a place that either can't do that or isn't doing it for political reasons. And so that's a problem, because diseases don't know borders and, it's not fair to the people in those places.
Wow. So what we're really saying is there is no real alternative to, this is one of the things the federal government should do. This is about protecting the homeland. It's the scientific version of having an army, right? It's here to protect us, and they are standing down.
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a lot about the bird flu last year, and there's been pretty much no testing of people this entire year. There's been very, very little of it. So I don't know if it's, if farm workers are still being infected by the bird flu. I know that birds are migrating around now, so we'll start seeing more bird flu cases on poultry farms, maybe again on dairy. Will we track it? Will we know if it's infecting people? And with that one, we won't know if it becomes something truly threatening until we see a surge of cases in hospitals. If we're not doing anything to test, we won't know until it's kind of too big to really control.
Yeah. Well, Amy, that's going to be our last word because we've run out of time. I can't thank you enough. And look, KFF is not sort of on normal people's radar screen who aren't deeply into health issues. But the writing that you do is not for scholars. It's for regular people. It's wonderful and accessible. So tell people how they find your work.
Thank you so much. You can go to KFF Health News. There's all sorts of stuff there. I've got my own page on KFF Health News. And I post most of it on Blue Sky, if you've got Blue Sky, with my name, Amy Maxmen.
Thank you, Amy. I hope the worst that we expect does not happen, but let's talk again in a few months.
I love that idea. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.